Good afternoon and welcome to the March webinar for the Spring Hydrologic Outlook. This is Kelsey Engel from the National Weather Service Central Region Headquarters. Today's briefing will be a general overview of the Spring Hydrologic Outlook for the Mississippi Basin, including the Red River of the North and Great Lake drainages. Additional information and forecasts can be found online at www.weather.gov. Today's presenters are Steve Buan from the North Central River Forecast Center, Jim Noel from the Ohio River Forecast Center, Kevin Lau from the Missouri Basin River Forecast Center, James Paul from the Arkansas Red Basin River Forecast Center, and Jeff Graschel from the Lower Mississippi River Forecast Center. This webinar is being recorded, and a follow-up email will be sent with information on how to access the recording later this week. If you have trouble with the Join Me slides not advancing during the webinar, please close your browser and log in again. Earlier this afternoon, these slides from today's presentation were also emailed, and this will provide another alternative to view the graphics presented. As Lisa mentioned, please hold all questions until the end of the presentation. We'll begin now with the first presenter, Steve Buan.
Thank you, Kelsey. For those of you who are not on the webinar portion but are going slide by slide, I will try to give out the title of the slides as we move along. So, without further ado, let's get going onto the winter precipitation slide. This is showing the winter precipitation to date from December 1st over the entire country, highlighted with a couple of circled areas there, indicating areas that have increased in the Mississippi watershed over the last 2 weeks. One thing you will notice here is that the areas of the northern plains through the central plains really have not participated in precipitation over the last 2 weeks, thus accentuating their below normal, the amount that they're below normal for the entire winter season, as indicated on the right-hand side of the slide, generally from the Dakotas down through Nebraska, Kansas, and even on down into Louisiana. Areas that are highlighted here being substantially above normal are the northern Rockies and portions of northern Minnesota and northern Wisconsin. The next slide, looking at the winter temperatures, this is just an update of what we showed last week. One thing to notice here, though, is that the area of that is at least 10 degrees below normal for the entire winter season has expanded from what it was 2 weeks ago. The upper Midwest having seen about one of the coldest last weeks of February on record, and those records dating back to the late 1800s. So this has been a fairly historical cold period and has the Mississippi Basin pretty locked in here, ongoing in a cold period. On to the next slide, the drought status. In the last 2 weeks, there's been a little bit of improvement in the drought status from Iowa and Illinois with a rain event that went through there and mitigated what was remaining of the drought in some of that areas, but it remains locked in from western Iowa and southwest Minnesota down through the central and southern plains. One thing that might prevent further improvement here this spring is this deep frozen ground that we have really throughout the region all the way down into the St. Louis area, basically from the Rockies to the Great Lakes down to the St. Louis area. Even in the St. Louis area, they're still reporting frost depths in that 1/2 to 1 foot range here in the first week of March, which is highly unusual for this time of the year. Areas with less snow cover in the Dakotas are looking at 4 to 5 feet of frost, and then as you move eastward into the area with the snowpack in the Wisconsin and Minnesota, 2 to 3 feet. Once you get over into the Michigan, though, frost generally is a little bit shallower, maybe around a foot, and that has somewhat to do with the soil types in that region. So still a solid mantle of frozen ground really all across the northern half of the country. That late winter flooding event that got going right about the time we were doing this briefing 2 weeks ago brought widespread minor to moderate flooding from extreme eastern Iowa across northern Illinois, Indiana, and northern Ohio. Even some major flooding due to ice jams in northern Ohio and southeast Iowa. We feel this is just kind of a little precursor or a little sneak preview of what we can expect with conditions evolving into spring in these areas. They're primed and ready to have flooding occur with the combination of frozen ground and thick ice. So this was just a little sneak preview. Moving on to the USGS streamflow conditions slide. Again, without the precipitation occurring, late winter precipitation in the central and southern plains, we see streamflows remaining below normal there, thus diminishing their potential, which we'll hear the details of later for any flooding. But we have seen increases in base streamflow into the Great Lakes, southern Great Lakes and Ohio Valley due to that rain event 2 weeks ago, therefore kind of keeping their soils moist and ready to produce higher streamflows with any spring rains. The Army Corps of Engineer update slide, still they have not had to use, with the last 2 weeks, any of the flood control storage nominally across the entire region, so therefore their flood control reservoirs remain with ample storage for any excess spring runoff. They've gone out and started measuring ice thickness on the Mississippi River, in particular on Lake Pepin, which is just southeast of the Twin Cities area. They're showing 19 to 30 inches of ice, which is near the maximum of the last 10 years. And that, I say greater than 30 inches because there was a location on the lake where they were trying to get through and they did not have enough extensions for the ice auger to punch all the way through. So extreme amount of ice on Lake Pepin at this time. We feel that's an indicator for ice on all the rivers in the Mississippi drainage, really, is that with this cold air, relatively higher stream flows going on, at least near normal, that there's been plenty of water to keep making ice on these rivers. And as we'll hear about later, it's probably going to lead to some problems this spring. The Corps of Engineers has also been out doing snow surveys throughout the upper Midwest over the last 2 weeks, and they're going to be doing more next week with the extreme snowpack in northern Minnesota and northern Wisconsin. Acquiring this data helps them plan for operations of their reservoirs, but also is extremely valuable to the Weather Service for producing these flood outlooks. So a shout out to the Corps for doing that work. On to the next slide of the snow water content across the Mississippi Valley. Here showing a pair of images, one from the 17th and 2 weeks later on March 3rd, with a few weather systems that have crisscrossed the region. There's been no real general increase in the pack, except we've picked up some in the plains, very thin amount of snow across the plains. And with the snow and ice storm that visited the lower Ohio Valley here about a week ago, there's still some residual snow in that area too. So we're not seeing a remarkable increase in the late winter snowpack, but it is sticking around. Moving on to looking forward now, what we can expect over the next week. This is a slide showing the accumulated precipitation forecast for the next week, and we see kind of in the middle there some light greens to maybe just a few splotches of blue, indicating fairly light precipitation expected over much of the entire Mississippi River Valley, with the exception of maybe the northern Rockies and the extreme eastern portions of the Ohio Valley. So with this indication, we would not expect any flooding to initiate, as this is indicative of a fairly cool weather regime over the entire Mississippi Valley, inhibiting any large storms and warm air from coming into the region. On to the next slide, looking at the week beyond that, on the left-hand side, we see that temperature outlook for probability outlook, anything in dark blue and dark purple, indicating a strong likelihood of seeing below normal temperatures over that period out through almost two-thirds of the way through the month. So really from the Great Lakes and Ohio Valley eastward, the country is going to see substantial probability that there's going to be below normal for that period. Maybe a little bit of warmer air moving into the northern plains area, maybe getting into the Hudson Bay drainages. This would be typical for this time of the year, that we would start to maybe see some melting out in that area. So maybe that could be a portending things to come. We can only hope. On the right-hand side, we see the probabilities for precipitation over that period, brown indicating lower likelihoods of seeing precipitation through much of the Mississippi Valley, with the exception maybe of the extreme northern Mississippi Valley into the Hudson Bay drainages of North Dakota, and the extreme eastern portion of the Ohio Valley. So all in all, for the next 2 weeks, we're not seeing meteorological signals that we're going to be transitioning into either a wet pattern or into a really strong warming pattern either. So things look to be on hold here for the next 2 weeks. Again, moving on now to our seasonal outlook. This has not been updated since our last talk 2 weeks ago. Again, just to refresh your memory, we're still out looking for a below normal spring period in the Great Lakes and upper Mississippi Valley, and possibly a wetter spring down in the Ohio Valley region. And that would be indicated on the right-hand side of the right-hand chart with the green area indicated over the Kentucky-Tennessee area. On to the next slide, the drought outlook. Again, this has not been updated, but we kept the slide in here just to review it again. Some residual areas of drought in the central Mississippi Valley off into the central plains. These areas stand to see some improvement here this spring. This may be predicated on getting this frozen ground situation taken care of, where we can thaw the ground out before we get the substantial amount of our spring precipitation. If we get our spring precipitation before the ground thaws out, we will see high runoff rates and not enough infiltration maybe to smooth out this drought situation, especially Iowa and Minnesota. And moving on to the next slide, titled Flood Outlook. This is a broad overview slide, something that you can get on the internet. This indicating, showing all of our forecast gauging locations within the Mississippi Valley, and color-coded at what is the 50% chance of exceeding flood stages. And so in the lightest brown dots, that would be the 50% chance of exceeding flood stage. The red dots indicating 50% chance of exceeding moderate, and there's two purple dots on there, a 50% chance of exceeding the major flood stage. It's kind of complicated to look at this graph here with all of the dots on there. It basically indicates that a lot of the Mississippi Valley, especially right near the main stem Mississippi River, has a reasonably seasonal or slightly above seasonal probabilities of flooding. And the enhanced area of flooding, I've taken off the green dots, which indicate a below 50% chance of exceeding flood stage. And now we can see a strong cluster of locations in the central Midwest extending into the Great Lakes across northern Illinois, southern Wisconsin, northern Indiana, northern Ohio into Michigan, where we see the highest threat here for significant flooding, and we'll get into some details on that shortly. You do see some other areas where there are red dots, and we'll get into the details of those as we go region by region here. So we'll now move on to the Ohio Valley region and Jim Noel.
All right, thanks, Steve. Yeah, it looks like on this first slide on the current forecast that we have out, there's still some lingering flooding in our Wabash Basin of western Indiana and eastern Illinois. And that's really from a combination of storms over the last couple of weeks, but mainly the storm a few weeks ago that brought heavy rain and snowmelt to parts of the Ohio Valley. Otherwise, things right now are actually fairly normal for this time of the year in the Ohio Basin. So if we move to the next slide, and we take a look at our spring flood outlook then, not much has changed over the last 2 weeks in the Ohio Valley. We're expecting minor to moderate flooding in the lower Ohio Valley, which is very common for this time of the year. Most of that will be rain-driven, though, and our main focus, as Steve was alluding to, continues to be in northern Indiana through northern Ohio, along the Wabash into the Maumee and the Great Lakes drainage into Lake Erie, especially because of still having a good 1 to 2 inches of snow water equivalent on the ground there, and that we also have some lingering ice jams that, especially in the Maumee Basin, that are still in existence, that if we get a heavy rain event along with the snowmelt, that could still cause renewed problems. On to the next slide, you will see that, again, this is just another way of looking at it. The flood risk is about 2 to 3 times the normal in northern Indiana and northern Ohio. Again, that's relative to normal. And those are the blue dots that you see across that region. and that extends a little bit up into northwestern Pennsylvania and some parts of the Allegheny Basin, but it's really primarily focused over northern Ohio and northern Indiana. The rest of the basin in green dots is really about a normal flood risk for this time of the year. So we move to our last slide for the Ohio Basin. To sum it up then, the flood season, one thing as Steve was alluding to, is with the cold temperatures, a little bit like last spring almost with the cold March then. Usually March is our peak flood season in the Ohio Basin, but likely that's going to get delayed and pushed out 2, 3, 4 weeks into more likely April. And also, we took a hard look at winters similar to this one, and we found that the only 3 years since 1960 that we really could find somewhat similar to this would be 1978-79 winter, 1993-94, and 1962 and 63. So as for rainfall in the Ohio Basin, we are expecting near to slightly above normal as we go through spring. And the water content in the snowpack in the upper Wabash Basin and the Maumee into the Great Lakes drainage of Lake Erie for northern Indiana and northern Ohio is where our primary focus is. So to sum it all up, we are expecting, as we were talking about 2 weeks ago, a near normal flood risk across the Ohio Basin for this spring, all the way out through April and May, except in northern Indiana and northern Ohio is the primary area of focus where it is above normal, and that's primarily due to the leftover, some ice jam and ice that's left over on those rivers, combined with that 1 to 2 inches of snow water content in our snowpack and any threat for some spring thaw and rain. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Steve to cover the upper Midwest and Great Lakes.
Okay. Thanks, Jim. So the slide we're looking at now is a slide of the North Central River Forecast Center simulated snow water equivalent as of early March. And what I want to point out here is the areas that are in the blue and the darkest shades of green from southern Michigan across the upper peninsula, northern Wisconsin into northeast Minnesota, and even in northern Illinois. Those are the areas that have really got the heavier snowpack. As you can see, though, one thing is that we're not seeing a uniformness to the snowpack. The nature of the storms this winter have been such that they've been kind of slicing and dicing across the area. Therefore, we've got pockets. So it's not universal. So some people say, well, it's not quite as big a deal here, but if I go 50 miles away, it's a big deal. And that's kind of what we're hearing from people about their snow. And so it's kind of hard to generalize the flood risk. But anyway, those are the areas of the heavier snow. You move over into the Red River Valley and the Hudson Bay drainages. Again, there's isolated pockets that have the higher snow water content, but those are also offset again by areas that have a much lower snow water content. So it's kind of a balance here, and I'll get into some details about how that's going to work in the Mississippi drainage. Again, how does this stand with history? The dark blue areas, a very anomalous snowpack, and especially want to highlight southern Michigan and northern Illinois, northern Indiana. And throughout the rest of my briefing here, I'm going to be a broken record on that. We're really focusing on that area as it's been quite a few years since we've seen a significant snowpack in this area that's hung on this long. So let's focus right in here on the Great Lakes, and especially we're going to go right into southern Michigan. We've got these areas here, again, as Jim alluded to, 2 to 3 times the climatologically normal risk for flooding throughout anywhere basically south of Saginaw, a line from Saginaw to Grand Rapids. These areas are seeing a 2 to 3 times the risk for flooding all the way throughout the drainage. Some areas are lit up with a red dot, some are with a brown dot, even some with a green. Just because it has a green dot doesn't mean that there's not a significant risk of flooding there, because the climatological risk may be something on the order of 10% for this time of year. And it may be 45% now. So we still have a significant risk of seeing flooding. We can't just go by the green dots. And if you need some, and if I don't address your area in particular in this briefing, please do not hesitate to contact your local weather forecast office or contact me, and we'll take you through any individual location that you're interested in any of the area. We can only give some general outlook on this briefing. Over into Wisconsin and upper Michigan, again, we see the dots are green and light brown here. but we do have that elevated risk. Again, because of the heavy snowpack in these regions, we have the elevated risk. It just doesn't always show up here at the 50% level. Moving into the Mississippi Valley, here's where things kind of get really complicated, and I've had some conversations with people about flood risk along and either side of the Mississippi. If you remember from some of the earlier charts we showed, most of the precipitation has really been accumulating east of the Mississippi, not west, and that pretty much goes all the way up into Minnesota. That you get on the east side. If you took Minnesota and split it in half, the eastern half of Minnesota has gotten much more precipitation than the western half. So if you're along the Mississippi River, it's really going to depend on where you are with respect to tributaries coming in from the eastern side, what your flood risk is. And so flood risk kind of alternates between relatively high flood risk on the Mississippi, then there's areas of lower flood risk, then areas of higher flood risk, and it's really associated with water coming in from the eastern side. So it's going to be very tricky to gauge your risk as the spring evolves here along the Mississippi River itself. When you're looking at northern Illinois and southern Wisconsin and northwest Indiana, we have a pretty darn good high flood risk here. We've seen the flooding occur the ending of February. We think we'll see everything like that and maybe even worse when we truly get spring to come, especially if it comes with a rain like it did in February. The anomalous frozen ground and the high snowpack in this region really is going to add up. We get on the west side of the Mississippi, we have the frozen ground but a much lighter snowpack, so when you're looking at Iowa rivers, southern Minnesota rivers, we have a diminished risk for flooding here. It doesn't mean there's no risk, but we have a diminishing risk for flooding because we don't have the snow. But if the rain system comes in on frozen ground, there still could be flooding in that region. Moving on to the Hudson Bay watershed, here's, again, a picture of where is the snow been accumulating in the winter and where hasn't it been accumulating. We've got a little pocket in the southern valley in the Fargo area and south where it's a little bit higher than what it is in some of the other areas, and we see some red dots indicating the 50% level for flooding along the main stem river there and some of the lower tributaries. And then we've got the central part of the valley, a little bit more of a lower risk for flooding, but then again in the northern valley, higher snow water content up there, a little wetter soils from the fall, and we've got another higher risk area. We move westward over towards the Souris River Basin and Minot. Upstream from Minot, it's drier soils, less snowfall, lower flood risk. You get downstream of Minot, where all of a sudden we've got the brown and red dots, wetter fall, higher snow water content in that area, a little bit higher flood risk. Devil's Lake, we don't have any dots there, but it's kind of right between those two watersheds. We're expecting about a 1/2 to 1 foot rise from where it is now, 1452.3, and there's just a 10% chance that we will hit what the level was last year, which was quite near, as you can see on the slide there, quite near the modern record peak back in 2011. So something to watch there for Devil's Lake if we get into a rainy pattern of what could happen up there. So to sum it all up here, in the north and west, the Mississippi River, near to below average snowpack, southern lower Michigan, I'm going to say it again, well above average snowpack, higher risk of flooding there. The cold winter and the frozen ground, the ice jams, those ice jams threat is not included in these probabilistic outlooks. So therefore, if we're expecting ice jams, you might see higher flood levels if you get them to form. And again, I'm going to say it one last time that the high concern for widespread significant flooding, northern Illinois, northern Indiana, and southern lower Michigan. But we're going to have to watch the weather because it doesn't look like it's going to come in the next couple weeks. It looks like more like an April event, as Jim was alluding to. So we're going to move on here to Kevin Lau at the Missouri Basin Forecast Center.
Thank you, Steve, and good afternoon, everyone. I will be talking about the flood potential within the Missouri Basin, and my talk will be divided into two parts: the mountains and the plains, because they're driven by separate precipitation forcings. So the flood risk this spring across the Missouri Basin varies. with slightly above normal risk for flooding existing in certain headwaters of the Missouri River above Fort Peck, for much of the Dakotas, and for the North Platte Basin. Slightly lower than normal risk exists for eastern Nebraska, western Iowa, and most of the state of Kansas. And the remainder of the basin has a near normal risk for spring flooding, including the Milk and the Yellowstone. Please note that near normal risk suggests that for locations which typically experience springtime flooding, they will probably experience flooding again this year. Areas having a below normal risk can still be projected to flood, but at a diminished likelihood. And likewise, areas having an above normal risk may still not be projected to actually flood. It's just that the percentage chance to see flooding is increased as compared to normal. So my first slide on the left is the NRCS map of the mountainous west, and shows the percent of normal snow water equivalent that we have. Snowpack conditions in the Missouri Basin mountains are above to well above average. The higher elevations of the Milk have about 120% of normal snow water equivalent. That's the liquid amount that's in the snow. The Yellowstone is about 150%. The Upper Missouri above Fort Peck about 140. The North Platte Basin has 120, and the South Platte is close to 140% of normal snow water equivalent. Now the right-hand side of the slide is the water supply forecast that is put out by the Natural Resources Conservation Service and collaborated with our office here with the National Weather Service. Now the March forecast will be issued next week. So what you see up there is a slightly old map. It is the February forecast. But I do have numbers, preliminary numbers for the March, and that's what I'll be discussing. The preliminary numbers would suggest that the March forecast that will be issued next week will show some increase over the map that you see on the right-hand side. The Milk is only increasing by about 5%. It's up to 95%. And what this is the projected volume of the snowmelt runoff, the projected volume. So the Milk is still slightly below average. The rest of the mountains, though, are above. The Missouri River above Fort Peck stands at about 120%. That's the projected seasonal volume that we expect this year. Yellowstone would be 133%, the North Platte at 118%, and the South Platte at 136%. Again, those are all projected volumes for this coming snowmelt season. Okay, the next slide is a typical snow water equivalent accumulation plot for a snowtail gauge. And I offer it not so much to show how much we are above normal, although we are, as you can see, but to show how far along in the accumulating season that we are. The light blue trace is the historic accumulation plot for the past 30 years. For this date, on March the 6th, we are typically about 80% of the way through the snow accumulating period. So the point that I'm trying to convey with this slide is that we still got a little bit of a ways to go, and things could change. Okay, the next slide, please. The next slide shows the plains snowpack. There is snow in the plains, as has already been alluded to during this call, but it is limited in areal extent and is quite shallow in the Missouri Basin. There are some reports in excess of 2 inches of snow water equivalent. That, again, is the liquid amount in the snow in the Milk Basin and also in some spots in North Dakota. But overall, the plains snowpack is not significant. The Black Hills have some reports in excess of 6 inches, but on average has about 3 to 4 inches generally. And that's that spot around Rapid City, South Dakota. Okay, the next slide, please. Okay, now I'm going to be going basin by basin and talking about the actual chance of a river basin to exceed flood stage. So I'll begin in the mountains with Wyoming and Montana. Although we do have a above normal snowpack in the mountains, the resulting melt-off is not expected to result in significant flooding, at least from snowmelt alone. Currently, we do project minor flooding possible in the Big Hole Basin in Montana and in the Wind, Laramie, and North Platte Basins in Wyoming. Again, all of these are just to minor flood stage. Next slide, please. Moving over into the Dakotas, wet soil conditions going into the winter, coupled with an extremely cold winter, has resulted in frozen ground conditions across much of the northern plains. So if we do build something of a plain snowpack, or if the timing of spring rains are such that they fall on still frozen ground, then we will see increased hydrologic activity. Long-range projections by our office this week suggest that minor flooding is possible along the Little Muddy and Apple Creeks and the Cannonball River, all in North Dakota. And minor flooding is also possible along the Grand, the White, the Big Sioux, and the Little Missouri Basin in South Dakota. Moderate flooding along the Cheyenne Basin in South Dakota is also projected. Now, higher than normal stream flow conditions in the fall, coupled with the unusually cold winter, has led to ice formation on many of the streams and rivers within the Missouri Basin. Ice jams have been reported along the Bighorn, Wind, Gallatin, Niobrara, North Platte, and Platte rivers thus far this season. However, the impacts to date have been localized and relatively minor. But ice jam flooding will continue to be a threat for the remainder of the winter. And as Steve already mentioned, the enhanced flooding chance due to ice jams are not reflected in the probabilistic outlooks that we are producing. Okay, the next slide, please. Moving down into the southern third of the Missouri Basin, as we've said before, convection drives springtime flooding in the southern part of the basin. Of course, any snow that does build up and quickly melts off does help to keep the soil moisture up. But thunderstorm activity is the primary cause of flooding. Preliminary long-range forecasts developed by this office this past week suggest the likelihood of minor flooding this spring in some areas of eastern Kansas, including the smaller streams in the Big Blue Basin and some that directly feed the Kansas River. There is the potential for moderate flooding in the Meridocene-Osage Basin on both sides of the Missouri-Kansas state line. On the Missouri side of the line, there is the potential to have moderate flooding in the Grand, and we have already experienced that. We had one location go into moderate flooding a couple of weeks ago. Also, several of the smaller headwaters that feed the Missouri River also have the likelihood of moderate flooding. Now, the Missouri River below Nebraska City itself may also have a few locations that will exceed minor flooding this spring. Again, the flooding in Kansas and Missouri is not atypical, and the flooding along the main stem that we are projecting is only due to convective activity on the tributaries below Gavin's Point. It has nothing to do with Gavin's Point's releases. Okay, the next slide. Okay, so to summarize what we're seeing in the Missouri Basin, we do have an above-average mountain snowpack, but we still have about 20% of the snow accumulation period remaining. And as of right now, we are not projecting significant flooding due to mountain snowmelt. We have an insignificant plains snowpack. Generally, we had wet conditions and above-average stream flow in the northern plains when we went into the winter. Wet fall soils and extremely cold temperatures has led to a deeply frozen ground condition across much of the plains north of Nebraska. Relatively minor and localized flooding due to ice jams has already occurred and will continue to be a threat. Only minor and, I've already said that next bullet. And in the southern third of the basin, we are likely to experience minor to moderate flooding due to thunderstorm activity. But again, this is not atypical. And with that, I'll turn it over to James.
Good afternoon, everyone. As Steve mentioned at the beginning of this call, drought continues to play a major role in the Arkansas Red Basin. In the upper left image, which shows the latest release from the U.S. Drought Monitor, you can see the severe to exceptional drought conditions in southeast Colorado, southwest Kansas, northeast New Mexico, the Texas Panhandle, and western Oklahoma. Drier conditions have continued to move eastward to encompass pretty much the entire part of the ABRFC. The lower left image indicates why, as during the past 2 weeks, much of the southeastern half of the basin has received up to 2 inches less than normal precipitation. We did have a small system come through last weekend, but it didn't do anything to really bring us to even normal precipitation. This basically continues the trend we've seen for the last several months of below normal precipitation across all of our area. The upper right image gives us an indication of the snowpack in the mountains of our western region. The NRCS SNOTEL snow water equivalent estimates continue to show above normal values in the headwaters of the Arkansas River above Pueblo Reservoir, while the sites in south central Colorado and north central New Mexico are below to well below normal. The next slide shows the ABRFC forecast points probabilities for flooding over the next 90 days. If you sat in on the webinar a couple of weeks ago, you'll notice that we now have a few locations where there is a slightly greater than 50% chance of minor flooding. This is not necessarily an indication of significant changes to current soil moisture or forecast precipitation inputs. It has more to do with the current 90-day forecast window that goes into the model and the last 2 weeks at the end of May that were added in this model compared to the last 2 weeks of February that were in the old model. The last 2 weeks of May generally have a higher historic probability of flooding, and that moved those points from green to orange. These conditions would be considered normal with respect to flood risk at this time. Finally, our summary slide. Most of the spring flooding in the ABRFC, as Kevin has mentioned in his briefing, is directly related to specific precipitation events. So it's difficult to pinpoint any specific areas at risk to flooding in a 90-day outlook for our basin, especially when the conditions are much drier than normal. Another important point to continue to remember is that the Arkansas and Red rivers are highly controlled by reservoirs, and much of the Corps and USBR projects generally have at least, if not more than, their flood pool storage available to capture any excess runoff that may occur if we do get a significant convective event. With all that being said, we are making a slight change to our flood outlook from what you saw a couple weeks ago. Where the drought conditions are worse, we are going to have a below normal flood risk, and the remaining areas are near normal. That's all I have. We'll go to Jeff down in Slidell.
All right, thanks, James. This is Jeff Graschel with the Lower Mississippi River Forecast Center. The graphic that you're seeing now is an indication of the rainfall that we've had over the last couple of weeks, and we've actually had quite a bit more than what James was showing here on his previous slides. We've had in excess of 5 to 6 inches along our coastal sections of Louisiana and Mississippi, and a good fair amount of 2 to 4 inches from Arkansas extending northeastward into the Tennessee area. What this has actually done is kind of alleviated some of the drought conditions that we had in the Louisiana area, across our area. And Steve, you can go to the next slide. Our outlook for the lower Mississippi River is really the same as what we had 2 weeks ago. Really, everything is driven by what happens in the Ohio and the Upper Miss and Missouri and the Arkansas Red River basins as well. So any rainfall that falls in this area really isn't for the Mississippi River, that is, it really isn't a player. We really have to look at what's going on upstream. And what we're seeing is really just seasonal averages across the lower parts of the Mississippi River and lower parts of the Ohio. The areas that are indicated in orange and red are really what we typically have for any particular late winter and spring flooding across the lower Mississippi River. So none of these areas are any different than what you would typically see for this time of year. And so the following slide I have is just kind of summary of the rainfall has really helped a little bit in the drought conditions that we did have in Louisiana, really seeing seasonal averages again for the lower Mississippi and Ohio. And just like James and Kevin had alluded to too on their stretches of the river systems, really a lot of it is driven by individual convective rainstorms. So snowmelt alone doesn't really give us problems on the lower part of the Mississippi River, but that combined with any sort of convective rainfalls that we could typically that we could get over the Ohio or the Mississippi or Missouri could play a role later on. But right now, based on what we see, we are looking at just seasonal averages. And that's really all I had, and I'll turn it over to Steve.
Okay, thanks, Jeff. So kind of to sum this up, the 2014 flood risk is considered near normal for a large part of the Mississippi River Basin. But again, hope it kind of dawned or it kind of revealed that there are pockets within the larger area that are at a more significant risk of flooding, and especially over there in Michigan, northern Indiana, northern Illinois. We feel that there's still ample time to get the word out there, to get the outreach done, local outreach, to get out to to folks that are at risk for flooding, especially with the recent examples they've had, using social media and things like that to get the type of information out that needs to happen. We think there's ample time for that because Mother Nature looks like it's going to take a little bit of time here in bringing spring to the Mississippi River Valley with the exceptionally cold temperatures still hanging on here for the next couple of weeks. We're certainly looking at late March into early April for things to really get going. So I guess that wraps it up. And Kelsey, I'll turn it back over to you.
Okay, thank you very much, Steve, and thanks to Jim, Kevin, James, and Jeff for today's presentation. Lisa, we would be happy to entertain questions now based upon the current conditions and the spring hydrologic outlook. Also, a reminder for everybody that for additional information to please check out our website. Go to www.weather.gov for additional information and forecasts.
At this time, I would like to remind everyone, in order to ask a question, please press star, then the number 1 on your telephone keypad. Again, that is star 1 on your telephone keypad. Again, that is star 1. And hold one moment. We do have a question. Your first question comes from Jay.
Hi, Jay. What's your question?
Jay, your line is open.
Good afternoon, Jay. What's your question?
He may have to unmute his phone. He may have muted it by himself.
Is anybody hearing?
Jay, this is Kevin. I can barely hear you.
Sorry, there must be something into it.
I still can't understand what you're saying, but I can hear you.
All right, Jay, unfortunately we can't hear you for your question, but if you will go ahead and email your question to one of the email addresses that you see above, we'll be happy to answer that at a later time. Lisa, do we have any further questions?
There are no more further questions in the queue at this time. There is one other question. Hold one moment.
Okay.
And your question comes from Charlie.
Good afternoon, Charlie. What's your question?
Howdy. Thanks again for the spring flooding outlook. As usual, it's very helpful to get the most up-to-date information from you guys. You mentioned the excessive depths of frost in the northern part of the basin. Do you have any estimates on frost depths in northern Missouri? I mean, we've got our just observed depths that people mentioned, but I wondered if you all had some sort of an average across northern Missouri?
This is Kevin. I don't.
Hi, Kevin.
I don't have it at the tips of my fingers, but I can get that for you and get back with you.
Okay, yeah, that would be great. This is Charlie Ducharme.
Oh, hey, Charlie.
Hi. Yeah, that would be real helpful. I know there's a lot of talk about it, and
okay,
not nearly as much as up north, but
right.
Still, if it's more than normal, then that tells us a little bit about the decrease in infiltration for any rainfall or snowmelt that happens.
Right, that's exactly right. Charlie, I've got your email, I believe, and I'll just give you a holler or email you back.
Okay, great.
You bet.
Thanks.
Thanks for your question, Charlie. Any additional questions, Lisa?
Hold one moment. We do have another question. Jay, your line is open.
Okay. Hi, gentlemen. How are you?
Doing great, Jay.
Thank you for the conference. Got a quick question on the ice on the lakes. Since they've been at the all-time, I think the lakes have been 100% capped over. How is that going to impact any of the potential flooding up in the northwest Indiana, northern Michigan, Illinois area?
Jay, I don't know that it will necessarily impact the river flooding, but certainly with such an ice pack on the lakes, that if we were going to get into a very windy spring storm period, that there could be ice problems with that ice being blown onto the shore and causing damage. Mainly, we're looking at nearly all the rivers in that region will probably experience some enhanced flooding due to just the ice clogging the passageways and things, of the water not being able to move with the initial breakup. So that's pretty much what we're looking for in their area.
Okay, thank you, gentlemen. Again, thank you for the conference.
You bet. Thank you for the question. Any additional questions, Lisa?
And again, that is star one on your telephone keypad. And there are no further questions in the queue at this time.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Lisa, and we appreciate everybody's participation this afternoon. And again, for additional information and ongoing information about current conditions and river as well as weather forecast, please visit www.weather.gov. Thanks again for your participation this afternoon.